History tells U.S. Omaha Beach was a fortress, a perfect killing field that was eventually broken by sheer American courage. But the battlefield itself holds a secret. A lie. Because on the morning of June 6th, the German defense wasn't breaking, it was winning. The plan was working perfectly. Until a single, confusing report of a ghost on the radio described a phantom enemy that was dismantling their fortress from the inside out. This is the story of that ghost, and the truth it was trying to tell. The concrete of the bunker was cold. It was a deep, damp cold that seeped through the wool of your uniform and settled in your bones. A permanent resident of this place, they called Widerstandsnest 62. For weeks, Corporal Franz Bauer had known this cold. He knew the smell of it: wet cement, stale cigarette smoke, and the faint, metallic tang of gun oil. He knew the sounds of it: the drip of condensation in the corner, the distant sigh of the channel surf, the nervous cough of the boy, Gunter, who fed the belts into his machine gun. This morning, however, there was a new sound. A low, guttural rumble that wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a world preparing to end. Franz leaned his forehead against the cool steel of his MG-42, the weapon they called Hitler's buzzsaw. It was his god and his curse, a masterpiece of engineering designed for a single, hideous purpose. On the maps back at headquarters, this beach, this crescent of sand the Allies would call Omaha, was a work of art, a masterpiece of death. Franz had seen the drawings himself. His gun, positioned here on the bluff, had a perfect, beautiful field of fire. It was an exercise in geometry. The lines of fire from his position and the others along the ridge crisscrossed over the sand below, creating a seamless web of interlocking death. There was no dead ground, no cover. The plan on paper was flawless, a cold, clean equation of German steel versus American flesh. And the equation always ended with the same result: annihilation. The naval bombardment had been terrifying. For over an hour, the world outside his narrow firing slit was a symphony of concussion, a relentless, physical beating that shook the dust from the ceiling and rattled his teeth in his skull. But through it all, there was a strange sense of comfort. It meant the plan was in motion. The overture was finished, and the main performance was about to begin. As the shelling lifted, an unnatural silence fell, broken only by the ringing in his ears. Smoke, thick and acrid, clung to the coastline, a gray curtain hiding the sea. And then, through a tear in that curtain, Franz saw it. It wasn't an armada. It was a city, a floating city of steel, stretching to the horizon, so vast and impossible that it felt like a hallucination. And from this city, a swarm of insects was detaching itself, buzzing toward the shore. Landing craft, dozens of them, then hundreds. They're coming, his lieutenant, a man with eyes already hollowed out by the Eastern Front, stated with grim satisfaction. Just as we planned. Let them come closer. Let them get their feet wet. Remember the training. Franz's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady, disciplined logic of the plan. He settled behind the gun, his hands finding their familiar places. He was no longer a boy from a Bavarian farm. He was a component, a critical piece of a magnificent, deadly machine. He watched as the first Higgins boat scraped against the shingle, its flat ramp beginning to lower. This was the moment, the apex of the equation. The ramp crashed down into the surf, and the men inside, packed tight like pins in a bowling alley, surged forward. Now, Franz. Now. The lieutenant screamed. Franz squeezed the trigger. The world dissolved into vibration and noise. The MG-42 roared to life, a monstrous, tearing sound that ripped the air apart. At 1,200 rounds per minute, it didn't fire individual bullets, it vomited a solid stream of hot metal. He traversed the gun, sweeping the stream of lead across the ramp, across the men wading through the knee-deep, blood-reddened water. He saw them fall. It was exactly like training, only the targets were screaming. They folded, they spun, they collapsed into the waves, their rifles sinking beneath them. The first boat was emptied in seconds. It was a perfect, horrific success. A textbook execution. But this is where the simple arithmetic of war, the beautiful, clean logic of the plan on the map, begins to break down. Because behind the first boat was a second, and a third, and a 10th. Ramps dropped all along the beach, and more men poured out. Franz and Gunter worked like factory men on an assembly line. Gunter fed a fresh belt of ammunition. Franz fired until the barrel glowed cherry red. They swapped the barrel. Gunter fed another belt. Franz fired again. They were killing them. They were slaughtering them. The bodies were piling up at the water's edge, forming a grotesque, human tide wall. And still, they kept coming. This was the anomaly. This was the part that wasn't in the briefing, the variable that broke the equation. Men were supposed to break. A unit that takes 10% casualties is supposed to falter. A unit that takes 50% is supposed to shatter and flee. The Americans on the beach below were taking 90% casualties, and they were not breaking. They were not even slowing down. They crawled forward over the bodies of their friends, dying in the open, dying behind the obstacles, dying in the water. But they never stopped moving forward. Franz felt a cold dread creep into his soul that had nothing to do with the damp concrete. He wasn't fighting soldiers anymore. He was fighting a religion. He was a man with a machine gun, trying to stop the tide. His lieutenant was shouting something, but Franz couldn't hear him over the gun and the screaming. All he could see were the endless gray boats and the endless stream of men, a river of humanity that seemed determined to drown his bunker under the sheer weight of its own dead. The plan was working perfectly, and yet, somehow, it was failing completely. He paused for a barrel change, the silence deafening, and stared through the smoke. The beautiful, deadly geometry of his killing field was still there, but the pieces on the board were refusing to play by the rules. How can you defeat an enemy that has decided death is an acceptable price of admission? Miles away from the blood-soaked sand, in a requisitioned French chateau serving as the command post for the German 352nd Infantry Division, the war was a much cleaner affair. Here, the battle wasn't fought with steel and flesh, but with grease pencils and acetate overlays. The air didn't smell of cordite and fear, it smelled of stale coffee, damp stone, and the nervous sweat of staff officers. On a vast table, a map depicted the Normandy coast not as a place of terror, but as a chessboard of immense strategic beauty. Each bunker, each machine gun nest, each artillery battery was a black icon, a piece in a perfectly arranged game. And according to the rules of this game, Germany was winning. The initial reports, crackling over the field telephones and delivered by breathless runners, were painting a masterpiece of defensive warfare. Landing at Sector Dahlgreen met with devastating fire. Enemy pinned on the beach. Heavy casualties inflicted at Easy Red. No penetration. American forces disorganized, seeking cover behind beach obstacles. Each message was a brushstroke, adding detail to a portrait of glorious, bloody victory. To the men in this room, men who had spent years studying military doctrine, the situation was unfolding exactly as the textbooks predicted. You have to understand the German defensive philosophy here. It was what military theorists call a crust defense. Imagine the beach is a bank vault. The German strategy wasn't to have guards patrolling inside the vault, it was to build a single, impossibly thick, steel door. The bunkers, the minefields, the interlocking machine gun nests, this was the door. The plan was simple and brutal. Any attacker would shatter themselves against this door, leaving their broken remnants to be swept away by the tide. The initial reports confirmed the theory. The door was holding. The Americans were breaking against it. The plan was working. The official explanation, therefore, was one of grim satisfaction. General Kreis, the division commander, allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The Americans, blinded by arrogance, had thrown their men into a meat grinder. Their attack was brave, yes, but it was also foolish, a frontal assault against one of the most heavily fortified coastlines in the world. The chaos was expected. The heavy American losses were the entire point of the design. The official story being drafted for high command was that the Normandy landing, at least in this sector, was on the verge of becoming a catastrophic failure, a second Dieppe. But the fog of war is a subtle poison. It doesn't arrive as a single, dramatic announcement of failure. It seeps in through the cracks, in the form of small, unsettling contradictions. It began with a silence. A specific silence. Widerstandsness 72, a key strong point guarding a gully a draw leading off the beach near Colleville, stopped reporting in. On the grand map, it was just one black icon among many. The initial assessment was logical, comforting. The radio was likely damaged in the naval bombardment. The telephone lines were probably cut. The men were too busy fighting to report. It was a simple equipment malfunction. An annoyance. Then, a second report arrived, this one from an artillery spotter positioned on a ridge half a mile inland. It was a confusing message, garbled by static and panic. The spotter was reporting small arms fire. Not the distant, thunderous roar from the beach, but the sharp, intimate crack of rifles and the burp of submachine guns. And the fire was coming from a position between him and the beach. Imagine you're a watchmaker, and you've just assembled a complex, beautiful timepiece. You know exactly how every gear and spring is supposed to interact. Then you listen to it, and somewhere deep inside the mechanism, you hear a click that doesn't belong. It's a sound that violates the very logic of the machine. That was the feeling in the command post. Small arms fire behind the main defensive line? Impossible. The door was sealed. Nothing was supposed to be through. A frantic check was made. Was it a paratrooper drop they'd missed? No, the skies were clear. Was it French resistance? Unlikely, not in this strength. The staff officers huddled around the map, their confidence beginning to fray at the edges. They looked at the silent icon for Widerstandsness 72, and then at the location of the artillery spotter. They drew a line between the two. The line ran straight through the Colleville Draw, the very gully that WN 72 was designed to seal. The silence from the bunker was no longer an equipment malfunction. The small arms fire inland was no longer a ghost. In that moment, the two pieces of contradictory evidence locked together, forming a new and terrifying picture. The click inside the watch was the sound of a gear tooth snapping. The official explanation, the story of a perfect, impenetrable defense, suddenly looked not just wrong, but fatally naive. The steel door hadn't just been dented. It had been breached. The map in General Kreis's command post was a lie. A beautiful, elegant, and now utterly fatal lie. It was a picture of the war as it was supposed to be, a landscape of German strength and Allied failure. But the frantic report from the artillery spotter, followed by the deafening silence from Widerstandsness 72, had torn a hole in that reality. Suddenly, the entire strategic situation was hanging by a thread, and that thread was a small, unassuming gully leading up from the sands of Omaha Beach. To understand the panic that was beginning to bloom in that French chateau, you don't need to be a general. You just need to understand how a castle is built. Think of the German Atlantic Wall as a medieval fortress. The beach is the moat. The machine gun bunkers are the high walls. The artillery further inland are the archers on the towers. The whole system is designed to kill the enemy in the moat and on the walls. It's predicated on one, single, absolute assumption that the enemy stays on the outside. The report of American infantry behind the main line of defense was the equivalent of a guard screaming that the enemy was suddenly in the castle's courtyard, without a single stone of the outer wall having fallen. It didn't just mean a position was lost, it meant the entire defensive philosophy was flawed. It meant the enemy hadn't shattered against the wall as planned. It meant they had found a crack, a key, and if they could get a platoon through that crack, they could get a company through. If they could get a company through, they could get a battalion. And a battalion, in the rear of the 352nd Division, could begin systematically dismantling the entire fortress from the inside out. The stakes were no longer about repelling an amphibious assault. That phase was over, whether the generals knew it yet or not. The new battle was for the integrity of the whole German line in Normandy. That gully, which on the map was just two contour lines close together labeled E1 draw, had just become the most important piece of real estate in the world. It was a dagger pointed at the spine of the German defense. If the Americans could push through that draw in force, they could get off the beach, establish a foothold on the high ground, and outflank the neighboring strongpoints, rolling them up one by one. The beautiful, interlocking fields of fire would be rendered useless as American riflemen began attacking them from the rear. The lie on the map was that Omaha Beach was a single, monolithic killing field. The reality, the one being paid for in blood down on the sand, was that it was a string of incredibly strong pearls, the Widerstandsness connected by a weaker thread. The Americans had just cut that thread. A new, frantic energy filled the command post. The comfortable rhythm of receiving victorious reports was shattered. Now, the questions came thick and fast. Who is in command at WN 72? Where are his reserves? Why isn't he calling for artillery support? But the radio was silent. The line was dead. The black icon on the map had become a black hole, sucking all certainty and order into it. General Kreis saw the danger with chilling clarity. He grabbed a phone. "Get me the 915th Grenadier Regiment. I want a counterattack. I want that draw sealed. Now." This is the point of no return. It's the moment a military mystery transforms from an intelligence problem into a tactical emergency. The question was no longer what is happening. It was how do we stop it before it consumes us. The time for analysis was over. The time for blind, desperate action had begun. An order was given, based on fragmented information and a terrifying premonition. A reserve unit, held back for just such a contingency, was being thrown into the fire. A handful of German grenadiers were about to be sent on a mission not to defend a line, but to hunt down a ghost, an American ghost, that had somehow slipped through the cracks of reality and was now threatening to burn the whole castle down. The fog of war had just solidified into a lethal, advancing threat. The men of the 915th Grenadier Regiment were not beach defenders. They were held in reserve, miles inland, billeted in the quiet farmhouses of Normandy. They had spent the morning listening to the distant thunder of the naval guns, a sound both terrifying and abstract. For them, the invasion was a rumor, a vibration in the air. They were the fire brigade, kept waiting in their station, polishing their equipment, and growing more anxious with every passing hour. Then, the alarm bell finally rang. The order was frantic, confused, and filled with a terrifying urgency. Americans are breaking through near Colleville. Move to the coast. Seal the E1 draw. Repel all enemy forces. Leading one of the forward platoons was Lieutenant Hans Vogel. Vogel was a veteran of the Russian front, a man who had seen the face of chaos and learned to find a grim logic within it. But this was different. In Russia, you could always see the enemy. The front was a line, a brutal but simple demarcation between US and them. Here, he was being sent to fight a phantom. He had no clear intelligence, no sense of the enemy's numbers or disposition. He was simply told to march toward a sound and plug a hole that, according to every plan he had ever seen, should not exist. As Vogel and his men double-timed it down the dusty farm roads toward the coast, the sounds of battle grew from a low rumble into a cacophony. The air thickened, tasting of salt and smoke. They passed columns of medics heading away from the fighting, their trucks filled with wounded, their faces pale and grim. This was the first clue. It wasn't the number of wounded that unsettled Vogel, it was the nature of their wounds. They were shredded, mangled, victims of artillery and overwhelming firepower. These were not the casualties of a contained skirmish. This was a slaughter. They reached the edge of the high ground overlooking the Colleville draw, taking cover in a thick hedgerow that bordered a fallow field. From here, Vogel could finally see the beach, or at least, a small, smoke-shrouded section of it. It was a vision from Dante's Inferno. Wreckage burned at the water's edge. The tide, turning red, lapped against a carpet of bodies. But it was what he didn't see that worried him more. He saw no organized assault waves, no clear lines of advancing troops. He saw only small groups of men, like ghosts in the smoke, flitting from the meager cover of a disabled tank to a pile of their own dead. Then, he found the first real clue. A young runner, his face smeared with dirt and tears, stumbled into their position. He was from the company that had been defending the draw itself. "They're gone, sir," the boy stammered, pointing vaguely toward the silent bunkers of WN 72. "All of them. Lieutenant Firking, all his men. The Americans, they came right up the gully. We never saw them." Vogel pressed the boy for details. "It wasn't a frontal assault," the boy explained. "It was infiltration. Small groups of Americans, led by a single, determined officer, had used the smoke and chaos as cover. While the main guns of the bunkers were busy firing down onto the beach, these small teams had crawled, inch by agonizing inch, up the steep, scrub-covered sides of the draw. They had moved between the arcs of fire, exploiting the one tiny seam in the fabric of death that the planners had overlooked. They were using hand grenades and audacity, attacking the bunkers not from the front, but from the sides and the rear. And then the runner handed Vogel something he had pulled from the body of a dead American officer. It was a map, a simple, mimeograph thing, but on it, someone had hand-drawn a route in pencil. It was a thin, wavering line that started at the water's edge, hugged the western slope of the E1 draw, and ended with an arrow pointing directly at the command trench behind Widerstandsness 72. Vogel stared at the map, a cold wave of understanding washing over him. This wasn't a random breakthrough born of desperation. This was a plan. A desperate, suicidal plan, perhaps, but a plan nonetheless. The Americans hadn't just found the key to the castle door by accident. Someone down there in that hellscape had looked at the impenetrable wall, identified the exact location of the keyhole, and was now leading a small band of men to turn it. For the first time that day, the enemy had a face. It wasn't a faceless horde, it was a thinking, calculating opponent. The hunt was on. The ghost had a trail. Vogel looked at his men, then down the slope into the chaos of the draw, where smoke and explosions still billowed. His mission was no longer to simply seal the draw. His new, terrifyingly specific mission was to find and kill the man who held that key before he unlocked the entire front. Armed with a newfound sense of purpose, Lieutenant Vogel felt a surge of cold, professional optimism. The enemy was no longer a phantom, he was a man with a map, leading a small team of infiltrators. Vogel, a veteran of anti-partisan warfare in the forests of Belarus, knew how to deal with this. This was a hunter's game. His platoon of grenadiers, rested and fully armed, held the high ground. The Americans were exhausted, disorganized, and trapped in the narrow confines of the gully below. The tactical situation, he reasoned, was overwhelmingly in his favor. It was a simple matter of sweeping down the draw, catching the Americans in a pincer, and annihilating them. The promising lead felt solid, like the stock of his rifle in his hands. He split his platoon into two sections. He would lead one down the eastern slope of the draw, while his veteran sergeant, Klaus, would take the other down the western slope. They would advance in parallel, their fire converging in the gully between them. Any American caught in the middle would be caught in an inescapable crossfire. It was a classic pincer movement, a tactic as old as canny, elegant in its brutal simplicity. No heroics, Vogel told his men, his voice sharp and confident. We are the hammer, Klaus is the anvil. We move slowly. We use the hedgerows. We crush whatever we find. They began their descent. The terrain was difficult, a tangle of thick gorse bushes, sunken farm lanes, and ancient, unyielding hedgerows. For the first 100 meters, everything went according to the plan. They moved with discipline, leapfrogging from cover to cover. The optimism held. This would be over quickly. They would retake the lost ground, avenge the men of WN 72, and become the heroes who sealed the breach. But the enemy, it turned out, was not just a man with a map. The enemy was a genius of improvisation, a master of chaos. As Vogel's section approached a dense thicket of trees, the world exploded. It wasn't a German mine, the sound was wrong. It was the deep, resonant thump-thump-thump of an American mortar, a sound they hadn't expected to hear so far inland. The shells walked their way up the slope with terrifying precision, forcing the grenadiers to dive for cover, hugging the damp earth as shrapnel tore through the leaves above them. The simple theory of a small, isolated infiltration team collapsed in that instant. Mortars required crews. Mortar crews required ammunition bearers. And accurate mortar fire required forward observers. This wasn't a handful of riflemen with grenades. This was an organized, combined arms team. And they weren't just reacting, they were anticipating. Vogel, his ears ringing, screamed for his men to push through the barrage, but a new sound joined the chorus, the distinctive, heavy chatter of a Browning M1919 machine gun. It was firing from a position he couldn't see, hidden somewhere on the opposite slope where Klaus and his men were supposed to be. It was firing not at Vogel, but across the draw, pinning his men in place while the mortars continued their deadly work. Suddenly, Vogel realized the sickening truth. He wasn't the hunter. He had walked straight into the jaws of a meticulously prepared trap. The Americans hadn't just punched through the line, they had immediately turned and fortified the shoulders of the breach. The man with the map hadn't just been an infiltrator, he had been the vanguard. The men following him weren't a disorganized rabble, they were the main event, and they had brought heavy weapons with them. The pincer movement had been reversed. Vogel's men were now the ones caught in the crossfire. The mortars pinned them from the front, and the machine gun raked their flank. His radio crackled. It was Klaus, his voice strained with panic. Lieutenant, we're taking heavy fire. They are everywhere. It's not a platoon. It's the whole damned American army. Vogel stared across the gully, his mind struggling to process the new, horrifying reality. He had been sent to hunt a fox, and had instead found himself locked in a cage with a wolf pack. The brilliant enemy gambit wasn't just about slipping through a crack. It was about luring the German reserves into a prepared killing zone. His confident sweep down the hill had just turned into a desperate fight for survival. The investigation had become a battle, and the promise of a quick victory had curdled into the bitter certainty of a massacre. Pinned down, bleeding men, with the terrifying symphony of American mortars and machine guns echoing off the slopes of the draw, Lieutenant Vogel's world had shrunk to a few square meters of muddy Norman earth. His perfect plan, his confident counterattack, had disintegrated into a desperate scramble for survival. His platoon was fractured, the two halves unable to support each other, bleeding casualties with every passing minute. Hope, which had burned so brightly just an hour before, was being systematically extinguished. They were trapped. They were dying. And headquarters was silent, deaf to their pleas, still operating under the fatal assumption that this was a minor incursion. Just as the vice of despair began to tighten its final turn, the breakthrough came. But it didn't come from a heroic charge or a sudden lull in the fighting. It came, as it so often does in war, from a piece of technology and the sharp eyes of a single, forgotten soldier. Miles to the east, perched in the steeple of a church in the village of Esnelles, was a German artillery forward observer team. Their primary mission that morning was to direct the fire of the 105mm guns of the Marcouf battery onto the British landing beaches, Gold and Juno. Omaha was not their sector, not their concern. But the man at the powerful observation scope, a young corporal named Ernst, was a methodical, almost obsessive observer. When the firing on his designated targets had slackened, he had done what good soldiers do. He had begun to systematically scan the entire horizon, simply to stay busy, to keep his mind off the earth-shaking chaos unfolding around him. His gaze swept past the smoke-shrouded chaos of Omaha, but something snagged his attention. A flicker of movement. Not on the beach, but on the water. It was a strange sight, something that didn't fit the pattern of the main assault. He adjusted the fine-tuning knob on his optics, the powerful Zeiss lenses bringing the distant scene into sharp, almost intimate focus. What he saw made no sense. It was a landing craft, an LCT landing craft, tank, but it was behaving erratically. Instead of charging straight for the beach like the others, it was moving parallel to the shore, almost hugging the smoke line, as if searching for something. Then, through a gap in the haze, he saw it. Perched on the deck of this landing craft was not a tank, as its name implied. It was a battery of rockets, rows and rows of them, mounted on crude-looking launchers, all aimed toward the high ground above Omaha. At that very moment, a voice crackled over the command net, a frantic, garbled plea from an infantry officer near the Colleville draw. It was Vogel, using the last of his radio's battery to send a blind, desperate report. Caught in a crossfire, heavy mortars accurate, feels like they are watching us in the church steeple. Corporal Ernst felt a jolt of pure adrenaline. The two pieces of information, the strange rocket ship on the water and the desperate plea from an infantryman miles away, collided in his mind. He swung his scope back to the LCT. He could see officers on its deck with binoculars, staring intently not at the beach, but at the exact section of the bluffs where Vogel's men were being cut to pieces. They were directing the fire. It was a naval vessel, acting as a floating, mobile artillery battery, providing pinpoint fire support for the infantry crawling up the draw. This was the source of the impossibly accurate mortar fire. It wasn't mortars at all. It was naval rockets. It was a brilliant, unorthodox, and utterly terrifying piece of improvisation. The Americans had found a way to bring the firepower of a destroyer and the precision of a sniper to bear on a single, tactical objective. It was a breakthrough from a completely unexpected direction, a weapon being used in a way no German doctrine had ever anticipated. Ernst grabbed his radio handset, his voice shaking with the importance of his discovery. He bypassed his own battery command and broadcast on the main divisional frequency, hoping someone, anyone, was listening. Fire control, this is Seadler 4. I have a priority target. LCT with rocket battery operating off Omaha, coordinates. A new, far more dangerous path forward had just been revealed. The key to saving Vogel's men and sealing the breach wasn't in the muddy hedgerows of the Colleville draw. It was miles out to sea. But to act on this intelligence required the German command to do something profoundly difficult: to admit that their entire understanding of the battle, of the enemy's capabilities and intentions, had been wrong from the very beginning. The message from Corporal Ernst, the artillery spotter in the church steeple, crackled into the command post of the 352nd Division like a heresy. It was a single, electrifying piece of information that, in a sane and logical world, should have been met with immediate, decisive action. It was the key. It was the explanation for every confusing report, every tactical failure of the last 2 hours. The phantom mortars, the unstoppable infiltration, Vogel's catastrophic counterattack, all of it could now be traced back to a single, unorthodox rocket boat lurking offshore. The ghost on the battlefield finally had a source. In the hands of an agile commander, this intelligence was a gift. It was a clear target, a defined threat that could be eliminated. A few well-aimed salvos from the heavy coastal batteries at Lons-sur-Mer, or even Marcouf, could obliterate the vessel, blinding the American advance, and giving Vogel's grenadiers the breathing room they so desperately needed to regain the initiative. It was the perfect, textbook solution: identify the linchpin of the enemy's attack and destroy it. But the truth, in war, is rarely a welcome guest, especially when it arrives wearing rags and contradicts the magnificent story the generals have been telling themselves all morning. When Ernst's report was read aloud to General Kreis and his staff, it was met not with relief, but with a sudden, tense silence. The air in the room grew thick with the weight of unspoken doubt and institutional pride. You see, the report about the rocket ship was not just a piece of tactical intelligence. It was an indictment. It was an uncomfortable truth that fundamentally challenged the core of their defensive strategy and, more dangerously, the official narrative of victory they had already begun to write. To accept Ernst's report as fact, the commanders would have to accept a cascade of deeply unsettling realities. First, they would have to admit that the enemy was not a disorganized rabble throwing themselves foolishly against a wall, but a clever, adaptive force capable of sophisticated combined arms operations right from the surf. Second, they would have to concede that their own intelligence had failed, that they had been completely blind to a critical piece of the American order of battle. A rocket-launching LCT wasn't in any of their recognition manuals. It was an unknown. And in war, the unknown is terrifying. But the most damning truth was this: if the Americans had managed to get organized fire support onto the bluffs, it meant the initial breach was far more severe than anyone wanted to believe. The infiltration wasn't just a lucky break, it was a calculated, supported, and expanding lodgment. To order the coastal batteries to shift their fire from the main landing fleets, the real targets, to hunt for a single, strange little boat, would be a tacit admission that the battle on the beach was being lost. It would be an admission that the impenetrable Atlantic wall had been cracked open by a handful of infantrymen and a jury-rigged rocket launcher. This was a truth so politically inconvenient, so contradictory to the image of German martial superiority, that it was almost impossible to swallow. It hinted at a catastrophic failure not of the soldiers on the line, but of the planners, the strategists, the very men standing in that room. And so, the system, designed to process information and make rational decisions, began to do what all large, proud bureaucracies do when faced with an uncomfortable reality: it began to protect itself. The report from Seadler lay on the command table like a lit grenade. It was a truth too raw, too disruptive to the fragile architecture of the official story. And so, the machinery of the German High Command, an organization built as much on procedure and pride as on tactical acumen, began to push back. The initial reaction wasn't a denial of the fact itself, but an attack on its source and its implications. A corporal, one of the staff colonels, scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "We are going to redirect the fire of a corps-level artillery asset based on the panicked report of a single corporal who is outside his designated observation sector?" The subtext was clear: this was a lapse in discipline, not a brilliant piece of intelligence. The messenger was being put on trial, not the message. Another officer, a man whose entire career was built on the precise logistics of coastal defense, chimed in. "Sir, with respect, the report is illogical. The Americans are fighting for their lives on the tide line. They lacked the command and control to coordinate a naval vessel with an infantry platoon a kilometer inland. It's impossible. He must be mistaken. He's probably seeing a destroyer firing its main guns and misidentifying the shell splashes as smaller rockets. It was a masterful piece of bureaucratic self-defense. They weren't calling the spotter a liar, they were simply reframing his observation as a hysterical misinterpretation. They were taking his sharp, specific, and terrifyingly accurate report and sanding it down, making it fit into the smoother, more comfortable narrative of a battle that was still going according to plan. The rocket-launching LCT was dismissed as a ghost ship, a product of battlefield stress. Corporal Ernst's report, a potential key to victory, was reclassified as battlefield noise. A message was sent back not to the artillery batteries, but to Ernst's immediate superior. Confirm Seattle 4 is not overextending his authority. Have him re-verify his sighting and stick to his assigned fire plan. It was a gentle but firm slap on the wrist. A direct order to stand down. Look where you're supposed to be looking. Report what you're supposed to be seeing. Do not disrupt the plan. And what of Lieutenant Vogel and the remnants of his platoon, bleeding and dying in the Colleyville draw? The system had an answer for that, too. If they were meeting stiffer-than-expected resistance, it could only mean one thing: they were fighting heroically, but they were failing. The problem wasn't a lack of artillery support, the problem was a lack of infantry resolve. The failure was on the ground, not in the command post. The final, crushing order was transmitted to what was left of the 915th Grenadier Regiment's forward elements. It was not an order to withdraw and regroup. It was not a promise of fire support. It was an order born of pure, arrogant denial. Breach at E. One draw must be contained at all costs. Press the attack. No retreat. For Vogel, huddled behind a dead cow in a Norman field, listening to the methodical thump-thump-thump of the rockets walking their way toward his position, this order was a death sentence. He had done his duty. He had found the enemy, identified their strength, located their secret weapon, and reported it up the chain of command. He had handed his superiors the truth. And in return, they had handed him back an order to charge headfirst into a machine gun, while insisting the machine gun wasn't really there. The system wasn't just pushing back, it was actively sacrificing its own men on the altar of a flawed plan. The conflict was no longer German versus American. It was now Vogel versus the crushing, fatal inertia of his own command. This was the bottom, the absolute nadir. For Lieutenant Vogel, the world had been stripped bare of strategy, of hope, of logic. All that remained was the brutal physics of incoming steel and the desperate, animal instinct to survive. The order to press the attack was not a military command, it was an absurdity, a cruel joke whispered from a distant, comfortable room. To attack would mean rising from the meager cover of the hedgerow, and to rise was to die. The American machine gun on the opposite slope stitched the air with invisible thread, while the rockets from the ghost ship offshore continued their relentless, methodical demolition of the landscape. He watched as a young private, no older than 17, finally broke. The boy, maddened by the concussions and the screams of the wounded, stood up and tried to run, not forward toward the enemy, but back, away from the noise. He made it 3 steps before the American gunner cut him in half. There was nothing to be done. No covering fire to give. No reprimand to shout. Just a quiet, sickening finality. Vogel's platoon, once a proud and disciplined unit of German grenadiers, had ceased to exist. It was now just a collection of terrified, isolated men, each trapped in his own private circle of hell. His sergeant, Klaus, was silent, his radio having gone dead an hour ago. Vogel could only assume the worst. He himself had a piece of shrapnel in his leg, a hot, nagging pain that was a distant second to the cold, crushing weight of his failure. He had failed his men. He had led them into a perfectly designed trap. But the greater, more profound failure was not his. It was the failure of a system that refused to listen, a command structure so blinded by its own plans that it could no longer see the reality of the battle. He had given them the key, the one piece of intelligence that could have saved his men and perhaps even turned the tide in this small, vital sector. And they had thrown it away. They had chosen the beautiful lie on the map over the ugly truth on the ground. The sun began its slow descent, the long afternoon shadows stretching across the field of slaughter. The intensity of the American fire lessened, not because of any German action, but because the Americans had achieved their objective. The breach was no longer a crack, it was a gaping wound. Through the draw, a steady stream of men and material was now flowing up from the beach, consolidating the foothold on the bluffs. The ghost that Vogel had been sent to hunt had become an army. The historical disaster he had tried to prevent was now irrevocably in motion. The failure to eliminate that one crucial target, the rocket LCT, had cost the 352nd Division its chance to contain the Omaha landing. The door had not only been unlocked, it had been kicked off its hinges. From this single point of penetration, American forces would spend the rest of the day and the next spreading out, rolling up the German strongpoints from the rear, just as Vogel had feared. Widerstandsness 62, where Corporal Franz Bauer was still fighting his own desperate battle, would eventually be flanked and silenced, not by a frontal assault from the sea, but by men who had come up a gully miles down the beach. As dusk settled, a new order finally crackled over Vogel's radio. It was not a commendation for his bravery. It was not an apology. It was a cold, bureaucratic command: all units are to execute a phased withdrawal to the second line of defense. Retreat. After all that, after ordering him to attack, after sacrificing the lives of his men for nothing, the High Command had finally acknowledged the reality they had denied all day. But for Vogel, lying among the dead and dying of his platoon, the order came hours too late. It was no longer a strategic maneuver. It was a confirmation of absolute, catastrophic defeat. The price of truth had been paid not by the men who ignored it, but by the men who had discovered it. The catastrophe unfolded with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier. For the men still fighting in the bunkers along the Omaha bluffs, the world shrank and then collapsed. Their fight, once part of a grand, coordinated defense, became a series of isolated, hopeless last stands. They were islands of resistance, their shores being eroded not by the sea in front of them, but by a rising tide of American infantry flooding the high ground behind them. At Widerstandsness 62, Corporal Franz Bauer didn't know about Lieutenant Vogel's doomed counterattack or the ignored reports. He only knew the impossible arithmetic of the battle had changed. The endless river of men coming from the sea had finally lessened, but a new and more terrifying threat had emerged. The sound of rifle fire, American rifle fire, the distinct crack of the M1 Garand, was now coming from his flank, from the direction of the Colleville Draw. He swung the blistering barrel of his MG-42 away from the beach for the first time all day, peering through the rear aperture of the bunker. He saw them, American soldiers, dozens of them, moving through the communication trenches that were supposed to connect his position to the rest of the German line. They weren't charging, they were hunting, moving with a grim professionalism, tossing grenades into command posts, systematically dismantling the nervous system of the defense from the inside. The beautiful, geometric killing field he had presided over all morning was now a trap, and he was the one inside it. The plan, so perfect on paper, had a fatal flaw: it assumed the enemy would stay in front. His lieutenant, the veteran of the Eastern Front, was screaming into a dead telephone, his face a mask of disbelief. They were cut off, surrounded. From Franz's perspective, it was a terrifying, inexplicable turn of events. How had they gotten behind him? It was impossible. But the bullets whizzing past the bunker's entrance were undeniably real. The drama was one of profound, tragic irony. Here were men who had performed their duty with lethal perfection, who had successfully held their section of the front against unimaginable odds, now being destroyed because a staff officer miles away had refused to believe a corporal in a church steeple. The final moments of WN 62 are lost to the chaos of battle, but we can piece them together from American after-action reports and the grim archaeology of the battlefield. The Americans, having poured through for years, the official history of Omaha Beach was a story of pure, simple heroism. It was a narrative of American grit and sacrifice, of brave men overcoming impossible odds through sheer force of will. But it was never the full story. The German side of the equation was often portrayed as a monolithic, faceless machine of death that was eventually, inevitably, broken. The nuances, the internal conflicts, the critical decisions that turned the tide, those remained buried in the fog, lost in translation, or locked away in classified archives. Then, decades later, the fog begins to lift. In the 1990s, German military archives, once held by the Americans and the British, are finally returned to a newly reunified Germany and declassified. Historians, for the first time, can pore over the daily war diaries, the signal logs, and the after-action reports of the 352nd Infantry Division. And buried deep within the records, a single entry comes to light. It is the proof from the German side, the voice of a man like Corporal Ernst, the observer in the church steeple, captured in the dry language of the artillery command post log. The entry is timed at approximately 0930 hours. It records an unverified report from observer Seadler 4 of a possible rocket-firing vessel operating off the Omaha sector. A second entry, timed at 10:15, notes that the report was deemed unlikely and that the observer was instructed to resume primary mission. A third and final entry, much later that day, notes that Seadler 4's position, the church steeple in Esnelles, had been destroyed by counter-battery fire. The man who saw the truth became a casualty of a battle he was no longer being allowed to fight. In that single, dry, bureaucratic exchange, the entire secret history of the battle is laid bare. It's the documentary proof of the story's central tragedy. It vindicates the doomed counterattack of Lieutenant Vogel's men. It is the declassified file that confirms, without emotion or embellishment, that a pivotal truth of the battle was seen, understood, and then fatally dismissed. At the same time, another piece of the puzzle surfaces from the Allied side. An oral history is taken from a retired U.S. Navy lieutenant, a man named William Dwinell. He was the commander of a little-known, experimental vessel on D-Day LCT R-524. The R stood for rocket. His mission was not part of the main assault plan. He was a floating reserve, a wild card, given to the assault commanders to be used at their discretion. He tells the historian how, seeing the slaughter on the beach and the infantry pinned down at the mouth of a gully, a U.S. Army colonel named George Taylor radioed him from the beach with a desperate, improvised fire mission. This was the same Colonel Taylor who, upon seeing the chaos on the sand, told his men, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." It was that same desperate, forward-thinking audacity that led him to call upon the ghost ship offshore. Taylor gave Dwinell the coordinates, and his crew spent the rest of the morning methodically walking their rockets up the Colleville Draw, blasting a path for the infantry. These two accounts, from two different sides, declassified 50 years apart, finally align. The German signal log and the American veteran's testimony locked together like two halves of a key. The ghost ship wasn't a ghost at all. It was real. And it was decisive. The bravery of the American soldiers on the sand was undeniable, but their courage was given a chance to succeed by this single, brilliant act of inter-service cooperation, an act that was seen, understood, and then tragically ignored by the men on the other side of the hill. The key to the Battle of Omaha Beach was identified, reported, and then fatally dismissed, leaving us with the timeless, chilling question of any war: what is the true cost of a truth that arrives before we are ready to hear it?